We're going to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and reading verses 3 to 11. Okay, 2 Corinthians 1, 3 to 11. Okay, let's begin reading at verse 3. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. For just as the sufferings of Christ flow over into our lives, so also through Christ our comfort overflows. If we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which produces in you patient endurance of the same sufferings we suffer. And our hope for you is firm, because we know that just as you share in our sufferings, so also you share in our comfort. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, in our hearts, we felt the sentence of death. But this happened so that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He has delivered us from such deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us, as you help us by your prayers. Then many will give thanks on our behalf for the gracious favour granted us in answer to the prayers of many. Well, this morning I want to continue our theme of good news. Now, we've been alternating throughout these autumn weeks, 1 week looking at prayer and 1 week looking at the good news. And this week we're back to the good news, and today's specific title would be The Gospel of Hope in Despair. The Gospel of Hope in Despair. We sometimes have a little phrase that we use in English when we think that things are changing, particularly, well, if I give you the phrase, you'll know what I mean, when we talk about the goalposts moving. When we thought that we had to reach one achievement, suddenly we find out that that is no longer the case, and we feel perhaps that there is no justification often when the goalposts move. Imagine what it would be like if the rules of football were changed. And the goalie doesn't just have to defend this great wide gap that he has between the posts. But in fact, what happens is that, there's a team of guys there who every time they see the ball coming towards them, they actually pick up the goal and move it somewhere else. I mean, it would make the game rather interesting, wouldn't it? Not only that, imagine that they could contract and expand the goal as well. So, this great big wide gaping hole suddenly becomes very small. I mean, it doesn't seem fair, does it? It reminds me of the days when, as children, we used to kick around a football. Now, in the absence of goalposts, we usually use somebody's jumper or something like that, or coat, and used to plonk it on the ground, and that would be the goalpost. And there were certain ones, of course, who would cheat a little bit, because they would be in goal, and when they thought nobody else was looking, they would kind of just move the coats in a little bit closer, and a little bit closer, and a little bit closer. And but of course we found a way around that because we realised, quite quickly that there was some cheating, and so we used to play on there was a local cricket pitch just near our home, so we used to play in the cricket field, and around the edge of the cricket field there was an iron fence with conveniently placed posts. And so we say, now that is the goalpost. And the iron fence marks it out between this post and this post. This is the goal. So we at least got one of our goals fixed. The only thing is that the other goal had to be kind of halfway across the cricket pitch. And that one still unfortunately got moved. So we never did quite actually solve that problem. But the thing is that when the goalposts moved, there was always a sense of injustice. Someone's cheating. It's not quite as we're supposed to be. And sometimes we feel a little bit like that in life. The goalposts are always moving. Just when you think one thing is set, suddenly it's something different. I feel very much like that in society at the moment. The goalposts are moving in all kinds of areas in society today. The things that we always took for granted, traditional values, for example, apparently no longer exist. I hear that this week, for example, that Germany is, I believe it's the first country, certainly the first country in Europe, to allow a third gender on forms. So it's no longer male, female, it's now male, female, or intersex. And I listened to someone, a champion for this, talking, and I thought to myself, how ridiculous. This intersex person, in the course of her interview, actually admitted that she considers herself to be a woman, so what's wrong with ticking female? Now, regardless of, what's going on inside her head, that doesn't really matter. But of course the goalposts are moved, and people are saying we no longer have these absolutes, and that's all part of the postmodern world in which we live in. But for the Christian, I think the goalposts sometimes feel as though they're moving too. I believe that's one of the reasons why there's so many divisions within the church. It's because goalposts get moved. No longer do we take the Bible at its word. No longer do we take it and just say, this is what God's word says. We now look at it and say, that might be what's written on the page, but what it actually means is, and then we try and explain it away. And we think it's being intellectual, we think we're being clever, but in fact we're actually twisting the word of God. Paul says to the Galatians at one point, he says, if anyone, he says, preaches to you a gospel other than the one that we preached, let him be eternally condemned. He's saying there is no movement. Paul was not one of those people who was sympathetic for those who said, let's have an alternative interpretation. He was very clear on his interpretation. He said, this is the gospel and this remains. Nothing changes. But we actually move the gospel usually to suit ourselves. And going back to all the kinds of sexual matters that are happening at the moment, even the church in many quarters is starting to think again on things like marriage. What is marriage? How do we define marriage? Is it really the union of one man and one woman? Or does it have to be so exclusive? Could it be more inclusive of others? Now, the problem there is that people have taken Scripture, they've reinterpreted to suit themselves. But that's the problem, it's to suit themselves. It's because we are thinking differently in society, therefore the church must adapt, apparently, in order to fit with what society thinks. And that's completely the wrong way of approaching it. And so we have to start with some absolutes, goalposts that never move. And that, of course, is found primarily in God himself. God never changes. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Never changes. Nothing about God ever changes. In fact, this is one of the wonderful things about God, is that he is consistent. Many years ago in my previous church, we had a children's group, and we had there were just a handful of children who were really, really unruly. And I remember the mother of one girl came in and said, I can't do anything with her. You know, at home, she's just exactly the same. She said, it's not unique, she said, to coming out to the church. She said, it's everywhere. She said, she's like it at school, she's like it at home. Everywhere you go, she's completely unruly. And she said, we can't do anything with her at all. Well, it just so happened that I had a lady who was helping me at the time with the children's work there. And she was a very kind lady, but she was very firm. And so as soon as this little girl stepped out of line, of course, she was quickly kicked back into touch again. Not literally, I hasten to add. But she was kicked back into touch. And it wasn't long before Mother came and said, you know, we begin to see a difference with her. That she's so different. First of all, she said, I can see when she's here that she's different. And she's starting to change at home and at school, etc. And then one day, the little girl herself, after a couple of years of knowing her, and she was a completely different child, and she said to this lady one day, she said, I like you. So the lady said to her, well, that's nice, because I like you too. And she said, yes, but she said, I like you because, she said, I know what I can and what I can't do with you. It's an interesting comment. And to come from, I forget how old she was by that stage, probably 9 years of age, something like that. It was a fascinating insight into the way in which her mind worked. And I remember having conversations with her mother and saying to her, well, you know, you just have to be a little firmer with her. And when you say no, you mean no. And when you do that with her, then she appreciates it, actually. She might not like it at the time, and at first she kicked up tantrums and all sorts of things, but eventually she knew where she stood. Now, what's that got to do with where we are this morning? The thing is that with God, he doesn't change. He doesn't move, therefore we must move. We must move. We have to change. We can't say God must conform to the way I'm thinking and I'm feeling. It has to be, I have to mould around him. And when I do that, then I find actually that things come together. And in actual fact, our lives become an awful lot easier as a result. Now, this morning we've called this the gospel of hope in despair. Why have we called it that? Well, firstly, because Paul speaks about despair. Sometimes we despair, don't we? Particularly when we're getting a little bit tired of a situation. We don't seem to be winning the battle, and we might suddenly say, I despair of this situation or circumstances. But what do we mean by that? It's just that I want to give up. What did Paul mean when he said it? Well, look, this is what he says, because we're kind of working backwards a little bit with this passage. I want to just remind you of verses 8 and 9. Paul is giving an example. If you like, this passage is divided into two sections. The first one is actually a section of praise to God. And the second one is a practical example of what's been happening in his life. And from verses 8 on, we get this practical example. So 8 and 9, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, in our hearts we felt the sentence of death. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God. He says, we thought we were going to die. That's how serious it got. And I don't think that Paul is exaggerating. He's not using hyperbole here. He means we thought the end had come. He doesn't actually tell us what the problem was. Let's just talk a little bit about the background to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians follows 1 Corinthians. Now, there's no surprise there, is there? But not only do they follow it in terms of chronology in the Bible here, but in terms of the chronology of time, they follow on. 1 Corinthians was written from the province of Asia. Now, Asia is not the same Asia as we know it today. For them, it would have been Western Turkey, and modern-day Western Turkey. And Paul was in the city of Ephesus, which you probably heard about. And from the city of Ephesus, I want you to imagine a great big arch, okay? A huge great arch. I just want you to imagine an arch. And at this side of the arch, at the bottom here, is Ephesus. And on this side of the arch, we have Corinth. Now, it would have been so easy for Paul to have got a ship and gone from Ephesus, quite a big port, right across to Corinth. That would have been the quickest way. But Paul says, I'm not going to do that. He says, I'm going to go around this great big arch to get to you. And in the process, I'm going to meet lots of other people along the way and have an opportunity to tell them about Jesus too. When he comes to 2 Corinthians, Paul is kind of about halfway round the arch. And he's got to Macedonia, which is northern Greece today. Corinth was southern Greece today. But here he is in Macedonia, and he's writing on to tell them, a follow-on from 1 Corinthians really, to say, 1 Corinthians to say, I'm coming to you. 2 Corinthians to say, I'm still coming to you. It's taken me a bit of a while to get here, but I will get there in the end. And in the meantime, let me just answer some of the questions that you've got. Somebody's described the books of Corinthians as being like a one-sided telephone conversation. You know what that's like, don't you? You hear somebody on the telephone, and you can just hear that one half of the conversation. The other half is hidden. And yet you can actually work out so much even from half a conversation. And we sometimes have to fill in the gaps a little bit, and that's true with the Corinthian letters. We get half of the story and then we fill in the gaps a little bit, and we get sort of almost a complete story, I think, out of it in the end. But Paul writing now from Macedonia, and he says, when we were back in the region of Asia, around about the places like Ephesus, etc., we went through some great hardships. Now, we know from the book of Acts, though he's not speaking specifically about those accounts in the book of Acts, but in the book of Acts, Paul was in Ephesus where a riot broke out, and some serious stuff started to happen in Ephesus. He had some hard times when he was there the first time round. And I think that probably on this particular journey as well, that there was trouble that came. And people were against Paul, and they did all sorts of things to Paul, to the point that, he despaired of life itself. Further on in 2 Corinthians, Paul gives some examples of the troubles that he has faced. And, let me just perhaps read some of these things to you. He says, let's take it from about verse 23. This is of chapter 11, 2 Corinthians 11, verse 23. Are they servants of Christ? I'm now talking out of my mind. I am more. I've worked much harder. I've been imprisoned more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 4 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and the day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in dangers from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false brothers. I have laboured and toiled and gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and I have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Those are the kinds of pressures that Paul records. And as you can see there, that he really has come close to death on a number of occasions. And as a result of that, he says, we despaired almost of life. Do you know, I've come across people too at different times who tell me they've despaired almost completely of life. They're usually suffering from great depression. Depression is a terrible condition. Amazing how many people suffer from it. Some of the world's most renowned people have suffered from great depression. Churchill, for example, referred to it as his black dog. He suffered an awful lot of depression. Abraham Lincoln suffered from great depression. Many others. And as Christians, we're not always exempt from it. Charles Spurgeon, the great preacher of a bygone era, suffered from great depression to the point that apparently his deacons used to have to physically get him and bring him out of the vestry and put him in the pulpit. That hasn't quite happened here yet. But, you can't imagine that, can you, of someone like Spurgeon? But, he suffered with huge depression. So Christians aren't exempt from that. But one thing that we do know is that we have a strategy. Because we're not exempt from all the pressures that come upon people in life. But we do have a strategy to cope. And I feel sorry for those people who don't have that strategy. And sometimes I hear people talking about their way of coping with depression, and very often it's not very satisfactory. Sometimes, of course, it's taking pills. Now, pills can give a chemical balance back to us, and they may help. And I'm not suggesting to anyone that they should stop treatment if they've got depression. Let's make that absolutely clear to begin with. Sometimes we can receive help from outside, but I believe there is something else that the Bible teaches us and shows us to help us when we come to the point of being at the point of absolute despair. And here it is, because Paul speaks about comfort. Let's have a look at what he says. Verses 3 to 6. Here we have comfort mentioned more frequently, more densely than at any other point in Scripture. In fact, Paul speaks about comfort more than anybody else in the whole of New Testament writing. But here he says in verses 3 to 6, that firstly he speaks about a Father of compassion and the God of all comfort. The God of all comfort. What does this God of all comfort do? Verse 4 tells us that he comforts us in our troubles. When we are despairing, even despairing of life itself, the God of all comfort comforts us in our troubles. We receive from him. But he goes on, and he says, having experienced that comfort from God himself, appreciated it and seen it at work in our own lives, we are then able to pass it on to those in any trouble. In verse 4. A little chain that's going on there. It's just like, a waterfall or something. The water flows down the first ledge and hits another one, and it flows a bit further on and then down another one. And he's saying comfort comes from God. He's the source of all comfort. And it flows out to us, and then when we're filled up with comfort, we pass it on to somebody else. And he's saying that because he says we have learned, he says, what it is to experience the God of all comfort in times of deepest trouble and trial. When we are despairing of life itself, we are reminded that there's a God who comforts us. And that's something for us to take hold of. So if comfort comes from God to us, he is the God of all comfort. There is no situation that you can possibly face where God does not provide the comfort that you need. The problem with comfort is that we have got a wrong idea of what comfort is, or what God's comfort is. You see, when we think of comfort, we think of things like those adverts that have a bottle of fabric conditioner falling onto a pile of towels which softly bounce up and down. And therefore we think that comfort is this soft, cuddly thing. But the word comfort literally means with strength. With strength. Come with fought strength. Comfort. That's what it means. He gives us strength is what it means. So when he says he's the God of all strength, all comfort, and he passes that strength on to us, that when we are feeling low, he says that it means that we now have enough strength to cope with even the greatest despairing situation. And then as a result of that, when we find others who are also despairing, we pass on what we have received, what we have learnt for ourselves to others. I remember in those physics lessons that seem many, many decades ago now, that we were taught something along the lines of this, about equal and opposite forces. That you take a desk and you put something on the desk. The reason that it stays on the desk and doesn't fall through the desk is because there is an equal and opposite force acting against it. Now, that is a complicated way, as far as I'm concerned, of saying that the desk is strong enough to take the weight. Now, our science teacher explained it to us like this, and he would take a walnut and a nutcracker, and he would take the walnut and he would give you the walnut, and he would say, I want you in your bare hand to crush the walnut. Now, with two walnuts I can do it, but with one on its own, that's a little harder if you're just using your hand. So you take the walnut in your hand and just try and crush, but the walnut's too strong. But he says, give me the walnut. And he takes a nutcracker and he puts it inside the cracker. And he says, let me show you how strong this is. And he would squeeze it just a little bit. And he's saying, I'll put a bit of pressure on. But the nut resists. And a bit more pressure, and the nut resists. And a bit more pressure, and the nut resists. And a bit more pressure, and bam, the nut goes everywhere. Because the pressure is too much. The nut is now no longer strong enough. Now, if the nutcracker becomes those despairing situations that we face in life that are squeezing down on us, then God is the nut, except for one thing, that he is not crushed. Paul speaks about that elsewhere. He says, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. We're hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. Why? Because of the God of all comfort. God gives me the strength in order to deal with the despair that I face. Therefore, what we find is that no matter what the pressure is, that God is greater than that pressure. No matter how much you put force against him, he will never crush like the walnut. The problem is, however, that Paul says that we were experiencing pressures and troubles beyond what we could bear. And that's the problem, is you see that that Paul is saying, I'm a bit like the walnut in the hands of somebody, no matter who they are, trying to crush that walnut. It's almost impossible to crush the walnut. But when real pressure comes on, when you get into the nutcracker, that's a different story. He says, and we are facing that crushing power on us, and we are about to be completely crushed, except for one thing, that we are shielded by Christ. We're shielded by Christ, the God of all comfort, that he comes and he strengthens us, and he puts like an outer layer around us that prevents anything from crushing us. And just as we learn in our physics lessons that the equal and the opposite force is, he says that for us, he says, we're discovering that there is just enough comfort in order to deal with the pressure that is upon us. As the pressure builds up, so also the comfort increases. To the point, he says, that we're able to cope in all situations. Now that's great news for us, but of course it's easier said than done, isn't it? As some of us perhaps have found out. But I want to say that thirdly here is that what that comfort leads to is to hope. And notice in verse 10, he says, God has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. Okay, he has delivered us in the past, and we have confidence to know that he will deliver us in the future. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us. On him. Our hope is on him. We trust in him. We put our faith in him. We rely totally on him. And Paul says we were tempted to ask the question, why are we suffering? Why are we suffering? And Paul says we're tempted to ask that same question for others when we see them under pressure. Is why is God allowing this to happen to this person and that person? And the answer that Paul gave, and in fact it's the same answer that we would give today, is this. That he says these pressures that we come under develop within us patient endurance. That we're able to build ourselves up, that we become stronger as a result of it. And that we are able to cope with the pressures perhaps more easily. Not in our own strength again, but in the strength that he supplies. He says it teaches us to rely on God. He says that's why it happened. We wondered why we got to the point of thinking our very lives were going to go, and then we realized that in the face of despair, realizing there was nothing more that I could do, says Paul, I got on my knees and I prayed. I turned to the Lord and I said, Lord, you are my only hope. I've exhausted every other avenue. Now it's only you. And that hasn't changed. That hasn't changed at all. Ties in very nicely, dovetails really with our alternate weeks that we've been preaching on prayer. Because prayer is such a key thing here. Paul recognizes that it was the prayers of many people that have helped him through. As you help us by your prayers, he says in verse 11. Then many will give thanks on our behalf for the gracious favour granted in answer to the prayers of many. He says we recognize that prayer really does change things. That prayer helps, that it sustains us, makes us stronger. Because prayer is all about dependence on God. Prayer is teaching us that we are not strong in ourselves, but in him we can do all things. Prayer is so important, such a key factor if we're going to see that comfort at work, if we're ever going to see that hope displayed inside of us. Paul says something else here as well, because he mentions about salvation earlier on. Here in verse 6, he says, if we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. Interesting, isn't it? for your strengthening and your salvation. And if we are comforted or strengthened, it is for your strength or comfort, which produces the patient endurance. Paul says there are times in our lives where we are distressed. But he says when we reach those distressed points in our lives, and by that he's not saying just that I'm in a mental state of distress, he's saying I'm having all sorts of persecutions against me because of what I'm doing, because I'm proclaiming the gospel. That is the only reason that people imprisoned Paul. It's the only reason the Jews flogged him. It's the reason that he had to run and escape for his life, is because he persisted to preach Christ. And as a result of that, he says, the distress that we have is that the gospel might give birth again and again to new baby Christians. He says, I want you to understand, he says, that we will endure the distresses that we face in order that the gospel might be fruitful. He says we don't think it's a hardship to endure, because we know as a result of it, good things, eternal things, will come out of it. The distresses that we face today may be very different, of course, to Paul's. Very few of us will find ourselves in the situations that he describes and that we read earlier. Very few of us will ever get flogged for our faith. Very few of us will ever be imprisoned for our faith. The worst we ever endure, perhaps, is a little bit of stick, as we sometimes call it, from someone for being a Christian. That's about it. I know things are tightening up politically against our beliefs. That the more we proclaim it, the more we're being described as, well, I haven't quite described as extremist, although I believe that word was used in one particular situation. But certainly we're starting to be branded along the lines of fanatical when we stand up for the gospel of Christ. So there may be more trouble coming further down the line. But what I want you to understand and to know for absolutely certain is this, that whatever trouble comes, whether it's just a little bit of stick from those around us, or whether it's real hardcore persecution, that whatever despair that we face, that the more we turn to him, the more we will find his comfort, his strength poured out upon us. The easier we will find it to cope. The more of an encouragement we will be to those around us who are struggling, who are weaker than we may be. And the greater our hope will become. And at the end of it, of course, the wonderful thing is that the further the gospel message reaches. And that's what it's all about. At the heart of everything we do as Christian people and as church is Jesus. And that's really, I suppose, if I wanted to summarize what we're saying this morning, is this, that we have to have a church that is Christ-centered. If everything revolves around him, therefore, to go back to where we were at the beginning with our moving goalposts, that he doesn't move but I do, so I revolve around him, then we have a firm, fixed datum point, if you like, from which everything else is determined. If you become the center of the universe, and that's what happens today, we've become very self-centered, everything revolves around me, the human being, the individual. Life must be as I want it, exactly the way I want it, when I want it. And of course that actually removes God from the center of our universe and puts me there as God. And I think probably one of the greatest deceptions of our age is that our God is not television, as sometimes is proclaimed from the pulpit. I'm guilty, I've said that. Our God is not money. I've said that too, guilty. Our God is not material. materialism, as sometimes said, and guilty again, I've said that too. Do you know, I've come to the conclusion that our God is ourselves. Because the money, the materialism, television, whatever it might be, fame, you name it, it's all about me, what I want. And we've got to take ourselves out of the centre and put Christ back in. And I want to encourage you today to make sure that that's where you are. Is Christ right at the centre of your life? Or does your life revolve around you? See, Paul had learnt the secret. He says we're not distressed when we find ourselves in the deepest despair, because God is at the centre. He becomes the anchor point. He says, when we thought we were about to lose our lives, what was the strength that he received? The strength was the great hope. He says, actually, my life is in God's hands. In fact, if we die for Christ. He says that very clearly in Philippians. For me to live is Christ, to die is gain. He says, I'm quite happy to be alive and to be doing the things that he wants me to, but actually if I lose my life, which one day of course I will, then he says, I know I'm into the presence of the Lord. So he says, I'm not going to worry about that. And we too need to develop that attitude of saying that with him in the centre, everything else revolves around. It's all for him. It's all for his glory. It's all about Jesus. And you need to be sure today that your life is centred around Jesus, not around you. And if your life is centred around you, there's one thing I'm going to guarantee, is that you're going to have all sorts of problems. Because you move, you shift, your thinking changes. The goalposts will move. If it's on Christ and you're conforming to him, nothing moves except you and you in the right direction.